Broadcasting from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps.
This show, the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, is in many ways modeled after Hardcore History with Dan Carlin. Hardcore History is perhaps the most well-known, most downloaded history podcast in the country. Dan Carlin's a fascinating guy. If you haven't heard the show, he gets deep into the philosophy behind historical events. And, I'm fascinated with that show. I wanted to have him on since we started this show. I am Joe Bacino, the host of the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast. I had an opportunity to speak with Dan Carlin, and that's what this show is, my discussion with him. We meandered through the Cold War. We touched on a lot of the subjects he's talked about on his show, and we get deep into things, into the root cause of things, the idea behind things. It was a fascinating discussion. Anytime you talk to Dan Carlin or you hear him talk about the Cold War, it's going to be interesting. And, frankly, he could probably talk about anything and make it interesting. So it was a thrill just to arrange for this discussion. It was a thrill to talk to him. I feel like I held my own in the discussion, and, we had a great talk about the Cold War. So, this is my discussion with the great Dan Carlin. I hope you enjoy it. Dan, we think about the Cold War now as a simpler time in many ways. And at least the start of the Cold War, the early Cold War was, I feel, in my mind, it was simpler in purely national security terms in the way we think about rivalries and national security. It was simpler. I mean, certainly it was simpler than World War II, and it was simpler than the global security structure now. Am I wrong?
I think you are. I think it was more difficult for any number of reasons, including the fact that I think that the leadership in the United States when the Cold War broke out was less capable than the leadership during the Second World War. And I think the fog of war at the time the fog of war in a giant global political sense, right? If you could expand it out to what is the other side doing behind the scenes in any number of different ways, I think it made it more complex, and especially when the Cold War moved to the stage where the other side, the Soviet Union, could do real damage to the United States and put it in a kind of danger that it hadn't been really in the Second World War. I think the fact that the people in the United States then felt a certain kind of vulnerability that they didn't feel in the Second World War, and that created a real sense of danger that made the tactical flexibility of the people at the time less robust. I mean, if you were the President Roosevelt in the Second World War, I feel like you had a lot more leeway to pursue the policies that you wanted to pursue, rather than if you were Truman during the Cold War and there was this sense that you had your finger on a hair trigger and one wrong move could unleash a third world war that would be potentially much more dangerous to the American people at home than the Second World War was. So I feel like the leadership was constrained. The margin for error was lessened. And I also think that the Cold War could have been handled very differently at the outset had, say, Roosevelt had lived and been in good shape, and his ability to, for example, have a direct relationship with the Soviet leadership. Whereas when the Cold War breaks out, there's no bat phone, right? There's very little contact between the two sides, which limits your ability to work your way out of it. And so, I mean, maybe that doesn't really classify itself as complexity, but I feel like a lot of the options that a Roosevelt might have had in the Second World War were denied to his successors in the Cold War.
Yeah, that is interesting. One thing about the transition from Roosevelt to Truman in picking this up is that nothing in Truman's life prepared him for this. He was vice president for 83 days. He had very little access to national security information. And, maybe nobody could have been prepared. Certainly FDR would have been more prepared. This was a new thing for everybody, but he had the kind of power that no man had ever had before.
Not only true, but I think we should also look at the fact that, when you're talking about sitting in the equivalent of the captain's chair here at the United States, there are a lot of figures right below the level of the presidency, very august, powerful, forceful figures that the president needs to sort of ride herd on in that era. And it would have taken there were a lot of other people perhaps that could have gotten the job and done it, but Truman was a particularly, in my opinion, unsuited guy for the job. I mean, I think he gets graded on a curve by historians because given his limitations, I think he probably performed okay. But had we seen a level of leadership that was much more decisive and able to sort of deal, I mean, when you look at, it's one of the things I admire Kennedy about when he takes over, is that this is a young guy later in the Cold War who has to deal with figures like Curtis LeMay and all these giant figures from the Second World War. And they can be overwhelming, both in a personality sense, almost in an intimidation sense. And so if you take it back to the Truman years, as you said, 83 days in office. I mean, Roosevelt didn't even tell him about the atomic bomb. Then he's got to deal with all these. I mean, you can see it in the face-off between Truman and MacArthur in Korea, when MacArthur is this superstar of military history, and Truman's got to somehow deal with this guy. Had you had a more major sort of political figure than Truman, somebody with a lot more gravitas, I think everything sort of plays out differently. So I think you can make a pretty good argument that tone is set for the Cold War by Truman, and Truman's limitations, I think, played a decent amount of influence in how that setup sort of was established at the foundational level that his successors then had to pivot off of,
Yeah, I think, I think that's certainly true in terms of the Korean War. But I think, you go to the Cold War. I think the Cold War probably starts in earnest in 1949. The Soviet Union successfully detonates an atomic bomb. Now we're in a great power war, a great power competition that we think about now. And all of the advantages that we had coming out of World War II are in some ways nullified by science and nullified by the Soviet capability. So we found ourselves in really a new global power structure, and even FDR would have been challenged by that.
I think so. I think the difference, and again, we have to make some distinctions about FDR, because FDR was not the same man in 1944, 45 that he was in 1938, 39, 40. I mean, very sick guy. And sometimes, and this is just my own opinion, sometimes he almost looks bored with the job. I mean, no one, as you know, has been elected to the U.S. presidency 4 times like he has. I mean, this is a guy who really had his finger on the pulse of the job. But those last 2 years, he was a really sick man. I would argue, and there is no right answer to this, but I would argue that when you see the Berlin blockade, you see things like the Marshall Plan, that these are all things that are setting the stage for this Cold War, trying to find ways to contain communism and all those sorts of things. The bomb, of course, that changes everything, but it's going to be a long time before the Soviet Union can really threaten the United States proper. But you're right, it nullifies a lot of the advantages. And the one advantage that we need to bring into the conversation here that the U.S. did have, and this ties into the Marshall Plan, is an enormous economic advantage. I mean, the rest of the world was devastated from the Second World War, and the United States, out of all the major powers, was actually enhanced. And so I feel like that's what the Marshall Plan was taking advantage of. Some of these things where the U.S. was in a position to support friendly governments, provide arms, ammunition, economic support for the rebuilding of their societies. There was a real feeling at the time that the societies that were in chaos and economic disorder were more prey to communism, and so the Marshall Plan would have built those places up. So, I feel like, as you pointed out, once the Soviets managed early, a couple of years before they were supposed to, detonate their own atomic weapon, it changes the equation, certainly.
And the next year, 1950, there's a visionary State Department official, a fellow named Paul Nitze, who writes a very stark memorandum, National Security Council 68. I've heard you talk about this, NSC 68. It's really, I feel like, first of all, I think it's kind of an maybe studied document, but if there's one document that really encapsulates the philosophical struggle of the Cold War, it's NSC 68. It's a very stark notion. And the sum of it, in some ways, is that in the United States, these powers are not going to be able to coexist. The Soviet Union would do anything in its power to achieve world domination.
NSC 68, you're right, very important. But you have to attach it to the other things that were done. The National Security Act of 1947. You look at 46 to 49, and you see a fundamental transformation in American policy. And we're still in that design of American foreign policy now. So if you wanted to talk about it, the equivalent of a fork in the road in American history, and Truman was leaning toward the other side. He didn't like NSC 68, and when the Korean War broke out, that was sort of the kick in the pants that made him sort of see the other side's opinion a little bit more. But you're right, NSC 68 was a sort of a scare paper, if you will. A lot of historians since have looked at this and said that this is an attempt to scare the power structure into things like tripling the defense budget, right? I mean, in the United States that's trying to find out how you have a soft landing from a wartime economy, tripling the defense budget was sort of going against the tide. But you needed a threat large enough to justify that. And so it wasn't just, Kennan had papers. There were all these people suggesting this global struggle for domination. And then when Korea breaks out, it seems like some of that stuff's coming true. But you're absolutely right. This is part of setting the course that creates the modern United States defense structure. And there was sort of a no turning back from that. There were several presidents who talked about getting out of that fork in the road later on down the ways. And it proved to be pretty difficult because once you make a decision such as the United States is going to defend the world from the encroachment of communism, that's a hard thing to walk back.
So if that's the fork in the road, what's the other turn then? Basically, Truman and the country committed to this policy of containment, and almost every action of the federal government is geared towards containing the Soviet Union, containing communism. What are the other options available to Truman?
Well, I think the other options are not to assume that the communist states are intent upon taking over the world. You have to have a different mindset. You have to look at the Soviet Union, for example, instead of seeing it as this monstrous state that is very, very powerful, and instead look at the other side of the coin that says, yeah, but they have all kinds of economic problems. They were devastated after the war. They have to rebuild housing and all sorts of basic infrastructure, and that even if they're able to put together some espionage that allows them to build some of the very sophisticated technological weapons, that doesn't compensate for the foundational economic and other problems that they have, where the United States is so powerful in those regards. So I think everybody was afraid, and rightly so, of a very powerful Red Army with a very powerful land forces and their positions in Central Europe. And when I was growing up as a kid, there was still this real attitude that you had to beware a giant Soviet thrust through Central Europe. And this was a U.S. foreign policy concern for decades. But the other way to see it would have been to say that the Soviets' internal problems, and not just the Soviets, because as you well know, this begins to incorporate communist China once their civil war ends, that their goals may have been much more peripheral than global. So certainly China and the Soviet Union are going to be concerned with buffer states and areas nearby. But is that the same as saying you need to worry about the Soviet Union taking over other continents or faraway places or Western Europe? And I don't know which answer is right, but when you say what's the other potential fork in the road, it's diplomacy, right? And it's going and trying to figure out ways to deal with this that are not sort of militarily confrontational. And that's where I think Truman really is ill-equipped for this, and where a Roosevelt, if he's not sick, is in a better position to sort of throw aside what his generals are saying and say, let me sit down with Stalin and we'll work this thing out. And that's not pie in the sky. He dealt with Stalin that way during the war.
So do you think that we, obviously this is hypothetical. Do you think we land, it's all hypothetical. Do you think we land in the same place if we follow a policy that you're describing here of diplomacy? That ultimately today, 2020, we end up with, at some point, the fall of the Soviet Union, and we end up with the global security order, the global world structure that we have right now?
Well, the answer is if everything remains as it was going, and in our diplomatic what-if scenario, then no. But there's many places that could have been disrupted along the way, right? So you could say we're going to pursue this policy of diplomacy, and then something bad happens in the mid-1950s, and maybe you end up on the same road after all, right? So the answer is if it worked, then yes, you end up in a different situation. You end up with different alliances. You end up with a different, the United States probably is not in a global policeman role to the same degree. We can't divorce this from the other things that were going on. And one of my favorite things to look at is the debate that started in the middle of the Second World War over what happens when the Second World War is over and you stop injecting all that money into the U.S. economy for the war effort, I mean, there was a real worry from about 1943-44 that the United States might just go back to the conditions that were in place before the great big defense buildup, before they became the arsenal of democracy, a worry that you could have the Great Depression return again. And if those people had their way, then they would want to keep priming the pump. And that's another almost non-defense related reason for NSC 68 and the National Security Act of 1947. In other words, creating a country that has a mission that justifies a ton of expenditures into this area, which are helping, put food on the table for Americans, creating an American middle class, all that kind of stuff. So I think all these things are pinging off each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all theater of the imagination, really, when you're talking about NSC 68 and what could have happened. Really, I guess the NSC 68 advocates would tell you that we needed to have a thriving middle class in order to defeat the Soviets and demonstrate the value of democratic principles and the way of life that we'd established here after World War II.
That's a great point, too, that needs to be brought into it, that none of this stuff is happening in a vacuum. And I'm as guilty as anybody at a tendency to look at the military and geopolitical side of this as sort of in a vacuum, when really it's all part of this larger affair. And like you said, even the ability to show off to the world that capitalism is superior to communism because look at how much better it helps people on the ground in their lives. So yeah, that's a great point to bring up, that when Khrushchev tours the United States and Vice President Richard Nixon shows him around, I mean, that's what Nixon is showing him. Look how great capitalism is. Can you do this for your people? And so, yes, I mean, all these things are interrelated, and I think we get a kind of a skewed vision of them when we divorce them from the times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so true. When we think about NSC 68 and the end of World War II, the way we had emerged as almost the sole benefactor, the sole clear benefactor financially, militarily, and the way the Korean War was adjudicated, it's interesting because the atomic bomb loomed over the Korean War, and yet it was never used. And none of our technological advantages were in play. They were all negated. In fact, we went back to almost regressed technologically further to the left of World War II, almost back to World War I, where there's, brute force slugfest over day-long fights over individual pieces of terrain. It's a very strange war.
Well, and the other thing is I love reading the stuff from the nuclear theorists, the Rand Corporation guys and the Herman Kahn guys and all those people, the wizards of Armageddon, as Frank Kaplan called them. Because when you read all of the thinking, and these are people that spent their whole lives trying to figure out, almost like a giant game of geopolitical chess, how and when and under what conditions you could use these weapons and use them in a way that made a difference. It's fascinating to see how a lot of the stuff that we saw after the Second World War in the Cold War, and Korea really being one of the few where you had big tank divisions facing other big tank. I mean, most of this stuff is guerrillas and insurgency and counterinsurgency and infiltration. And the reason, in part, that this is because these wizards of Armageddon were constantly asking the question, how do you use nuclear weapons in a case where somebody doesn't just invade? If they just sort of slowly but surely infiltrate and undermine. And I mean, it's not really a situation that nuclear weapons, that there's no real trigger point, right? Where you say, okay, that's, you have one more communist infiltrator and we're dropping the bomb. And you have this global struggle with a lot of countries that are sort of on the periphery, the non-aligned countries, for example, as you pointed out, where you have it's almost like a propaganda war for the rest of the world. And if one side drops a nuclear weapon, they end up looking bad to the rest of the world. So you got to be very careful how you apply those kind of things. And Korea was the one time, I think, I mean, there were some large-scale conflicts in Vietnam, but Korea is really where you still had some tank divisions against tank divisions, and MacArthur's in there with Incheon landings behind the front line, and the Chinese swarm in with hundreds of thousands of troops. But as you pointed out, it's the terrain. I mean, Korea is a tough place to fight. It's hilly, it's mountainous, it's cold as all get out in the winter. And it was a slugfest. I mean, it's not the flat plains of Central Europe where aircraft and tank divisions can control things as well. And you had infiltrators too, and you had civilians in the way. I mean, it was a really tough situation. Korea is an unheralded sort of war and a not talked about enough war in the U.S. My father was on an aircraft carrier in that war and never saw anything. As he told me, he saw Hawaii most of the time. But he had buddies whose feet were frozen off at the Chosin Reservoir. I mean, it was really rough. And because the Second World War was only 5 years before, it was so overshadowed. But in terms of ground zero suffering, I mean, it was one of the worst conflicts in that whole era.
It really was just a brutal fighting, and particularly when you think about, Battle of the Chosin Reservoir was around the time that you and I are recording this. When we come out of Korea, really Korea and the firing of MacArthur in many ways helped sink Truman, his presidency, and then Eisenhower is next. Eisenhower's next president. We talk about Eisenhower a fair amount on this show, and we had a couple of other historians on here who were very critical of his national security strategy and his philosophy. He put a lot of faith in strategic bombing. And I guess the idea that if you show the capability for strategic bombing and the capability to drop nukes, you never really have to do it. How do you evaluate Eisenhower's national security policy?
Well, let me confess my own biases. I kind of like Eisenhower. I think he was, it's a really interesting time to have a general running the United States, because obviously we think about that as a civilian role. Now, obviously, as we both know, Truman served out his terms, but when he essentially has to hand over things to Eisenhower, he hands over a bunch of sort of unfinished projects, Korea being one of them. And Eisenhower said, I shall go to Korea, and all those sorts of things. And the United States public thought, if we turn the war over to a general, maybe he'll be able to wrap this thing up. Because by the time Eisenhower takes charge, people are really tired of what is a stalemate in Korea. And not just a stalemate, but at a time when the Soviets are gaining more and more ability in their atomic nuclear realm, it's a dangerous stalemate, right? I mean, it's dangerous enough in the Cold War world when you don't have a hot war going on, and Korea's a hot war. I think that Eisenhower was in a position to do some things that he and Kennedy both tried to pay some attention to, which is try to figure out how the United States could continue this sort of foreign policy and pay for it. That's the problem to get back to NC 68. They were going to fund this thing, this tripling of the U.S. defense budget, and they were going to do it in an almost deficit funding sense, figuring, okay, we have a horrible crisis on our hands. We're going to pay what we need to pay, but you can't do that forever. And nuclear weapons were seen by a lot of people, Eisenhower at times included, as a way to save money. I mean, you could cut conventional spending on tanks and planes and those kinds of things and use nuclear weapons as a giant big stick to make up the difference, perhaps. And this is to get back to the Wizards of Armageddon idea. I mean, they would sit there and try to figure out, can you? I mean, is that something that would actually work? Or are you eliminating important key elements in your defense structure that at times when nuclear weapons are not applicable or won't get the job done, in a Clausewitz kind of sense, right? If war is policy, continue by other means. If the nuclear weapons won't give you the political outcome you need, maybe you need the conventional weapons. And if so, how do you pay for it all? I appreciated Eisenhower's attempts to try to figure that out. I think a lot of what we're talking about now is so much clearer in hindsight than it was then. Strategic bombing is a perfect example. Even going back to the Second World War, you can look and say, wow, I'm not sure that the strategic bombing in the Second World War achieved what its proponents thought it would achieve, but they didn't know that. And so I think a lot of this stuff is colored by and we started the conversation with this, the equivalent of the fog of war, but in a geostrategic sense, right? I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And some of this stuff is untested. And even the strategic bombing people could argue, and did, that if it was less than decisive in the Second World War, that was just because the capabilities of the weapon systems had not been developed enough yet, right? I mean, strategic bombers armed with nuclear weapons might very well fulfill the prophecies of the air philosophers, going back to almost the First World War. So to answer your question, I guess, I think Eisenhower, in my own opinion, my own very limited opinion, struggled to incorporate how you deal with what Harry Truman set into motion in any sort of a long-term sense. And I'm not sure you can say that he achieved that, but I also think I'm not sure that given the political constraints, it was achievable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. That certainly, I think puts it in perspective. Well, all these things have to be understood in the perspective of their day, right? And so he certainly felt that a strong economy and therefore a smaller defense budget and a balanced budget was key to beating the Soviets. That was a key plank in his new look strategy.
Well, and look at how it turned out. I mean, one could argue that by the 1980s, you saw that the economic underpinnings of the Soviet system were destroying it from within and were unsustainable. These trends were not clear, but were certainly the beginnings of them were perceivable in Eisenhower's time. So if this is a long marathon, then maybe figuring out a way that we can just keep going will outlast the opponents, especially if you're constrained in a way where in a Second World War sense, you're not going to have some Third World War where you beat these guys. Once nuclear weapons comes into play, the costs of doing that just seem disproportionate, right? I mean, so if this is going to be some sort of marathon and your economic viability, it determines whether or not you make it to the finish line, well, then figuring out how you do this without spending yourself into oblivion seems to be a pretty key plank in the strategy. I mean, I think maybe, again, arguing from a totally 2020 hindsight position. And remember, that generation was also a generation that was very concerned with living within your means, not having giant deficits. And these days, we're less concerned about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting to think about it in terms of the culture of the day, which I guess I hadn't really been thinking about it that way. Behind Eisenhower, you've got, obviously, President Kennedy, who, he's really influenced by people like Maxwell Taylor and even Jim Gavin. The Maxwell Taylor book focuses on the uncertain trumpet is what it's called, the uncertainty of future wars. And Kennedy and McNamara, Robert McNamara, the Kennedy SecDef, one of the whiz kids, is very focused on asymmetric advantages short of nuclear war. And they're focused on, brush fire wars, proxy fights, and, how does that go for them in the first 3 years?
Well, that's the counterinsurgency stuff we were talking about earlier. And and this, it's funny because it's fun to connect the dots all the way backwards and say, okay, this is a consequence. I mean, not to talk too much about the actual podcast I'm working on right now, but the Japanese marketing strategy, as I like to call it in the Second World War, the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, whether you believe this was propaganda or whether you believe that this was the Pan-Asianism that was popular in Asia during the period, what they did, either intentionally or inadvertently, is weaken the hold of the colonial powers in places like Asia, Britain, France, the Dutch, and whatnot. And so when they leave at the end of the Second World War, when they're defeated, it becomes this period where you kind of have to figure out, okay, did the colonial powers that the Japanese threw out just come back to where they were? And in a place like Vietnam, for example, which was French-controlled before the Japanese threw them out of there, that is what happened. The French thought, okay, we're just going to go back to where we were, reestablish ourselves in the colonial possessions, but everything had changed. And so that's where you get these kind of brushfire wars like you're talking about, where in Vietnam is a perfect example. So the French come back in and try to reestablish control in the 1950s. But there are insurgency movements that you can trace back all the way to the Japanese occupation. And now you have the civil war in China between the nationalists and the communists finishing up. And the communists, of course, are victorious. And so what they start doing is support their brethren in some of these areas close by. And of course, Vietnam's close by, Korea's close by. And so these become areas where in this post-colonial world, they're trying to figure out, and Korea is a wonderful test case, because if you don't want to have another Korea where you send T-34s, over the 38th parallel in a ground war reminiscent of a small Second World War conflict, how do you do it? Well, you start sending in guerrillas and you start turning people in South Vietnam slowly to your cause and have them working behind the scenes. And it becomes a situation where at no point do you ever actually trigger a war. So when they're fighting the French, it gets really hot and heavy. The United States actually at one time was thinking about using nuclear weapons against the North Vietnamese, the Viet Minh actually at the time. And so when we slowly but surely begin to try to sort of, I don't know what the proper word would be. I mean, there was a transition almost unconsciously to taking over the French position here and supporting an independent South Vietnam. But we'll see this same situation, won't we, play out over and over again, where you have a communist part of the country and a part of the country that's a part of the free world, with each side supporting their proxies in these places, and then trying to figure out whether or not you can have these proxies adequately conduct the war themselves. And I think that's how the U.S. under Kennedy gets sucked in, because the idea here is we're going to supply the South Vietnamese government, which is the government we were aligned with the free world. We're going to give them the arms and the weapons to take care of themselves. What was the line from the British said, give us the tools and we'll finish the job. Well, that's what we were hoping the South Vietnamese would do, right? You give them the tools and they'll finish the job. But when they got into trouble, what do you do then? Do you let them fall? Especially once you start sinking money into this thing, it becomes like an investment. And it started out with U.S. advisors who were simply training. Then it went from U.S. advisors who were training to U.S. advisors who were helping. And then you get to this point where you actually have Americans in harm's way. And one of the things Kennedy did was up the number of U.S. helpers in that area that were in harm's way. And then it almost becomes like tripwire troops, or the same kind of troops we have in Korea now, where if things go wrong, all of a sudden you have U.S. forces in danger. So I think when we look at Kennedy, I think we need to look at his age a little bit, because Kennedy, along with Teddy Roosevelt, are two of the youngest presidents we've ever had. And he comes into office when you had these, takes over from a two-term general, right, a guy who was commanding the entire free world's military for a while. And he's a kid almost, right? And a junior officer kind of guy. And he walks into these rooms with people like Curtis LeMay and all these kind of guys. And he'll acquiesce initially to what they want to do. He inherits a lot of plans from Eisenhower. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba is one of those plans, for example. And when it goes wrong, Kennedy decides he can't just trust these people. He made a line about the brass hats, he called them, meaning these generals and these admirals and these Air Force guys. And he wasn't just going to listen to them anymore. He was going to really kind of more closely consider what they had. The same thing with the CIA, going to more closely consider what they had to say. And so I think on something like Vietnam, I think Kennedy was trying to figure it out a bit more for himself by 2 years into his presidency, which of course was cut short in like year 3. But I think some of what he was doing were the logical extensions of the policies of his predecessor.
Yeah, there was a conscious decision by Eisenhower to assume at least part of the French position after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And then I think for Kennedy, you're in it, you're committed to it, and then it's sort of getting away from you, and it's accumulation of addition to the work. And then the same thing really in some ways for Johnson, right? Lyndon Johnson, in some ways like Truman, Lyndon Johnson is president because the president died, and he finds himself in this position. And in the position he found himself in Vietnam is that the country's committed to it, and he has to have some measure of looking like a Cold Warrior, right?
Well, and we have to understand something else, and this is part of I guess we can wrap it up into my fog of war line, but it's the blinders that people have on at the time, because it would be very easy to look back now and go, who cares about Vietnam, right?
That's right.
Why would you take all these American lives and blood and treasure past a certain point for a little country that most Americans couldn't find on a map? But of course, they believed in something called the domino theory. This idea that it wasn't about Vietnam. That Vietnam was just a stepping stone to the next place next door, which would be a stepping stone to the next place. And eventually you look up and the whole world's communist. If you don't buy the domino theory, and it's easy for us to not buy it now because it didn't turn out that way. That's how these things work, right? But if you don't buy that theory, it's easy to write all these places off as peripheral, non-important places, certainly not worth a nuclear war over. But that's a luxury that they didn't have at the time, just like we're bound by our own versions of that today that maybe future people will look back on and go, can you believe how ridiculous their worldviews were? But you can't know that at the time, especially when really intelligent people who study this their whole lives are telling you, listen, you can't let Vietnam fall, or, next goes Laos and Cambodia, which, Laos and Cambodia were very realistic things. But again, I don't think Americans would have cared so much about that unless you start talking about then Japan, or you start talking about big places, and then people have to go, okay, then we'll have Soviet Union and Mexico after a while. And that was the worry about Cuba, right? It's like they're jumping an ocean all of a sudden and getting established in Monroe Doctrine territory.
Yeah. Now, where Lyndon Johnson, I think, deserves criticism, and I'm sure you and I will agree with this, is where he deserves criticism, where McNamara and Nixon and even William Westmoreland deserve criticism, is that at a certain point they were intentionally deceptive about what was happening in Vietnam with the American people. And so Kennedy's involvement in Vietnam, I think, understood in its day, we can understand that and even in some ways applaud the decision-making. And Johnson was kind of a victim in some ways of circumstance. But, by 1968, I think really after Tet, there was a real plan of deception. And for that, history has to hold them to account.
I think this is, I happen to be a fan of our political system here, but I think we have to understand that there are some downsides in systems where you have to appeal to voters and an electorate and everything else, especially when an opponent who doesn't have any of the trials and tribulations of command, like how Kennedy slammed the Eisenhower administration for the so-called missile gap. But there was no missile gap. But Eisenhower can't say that, right? So, this is one of the problems in our system is that if a Nixon or a Johnson were to try to figure out a way to pull out of Vietnam, to just throw one thing out there, well, that opens you up to charges of being soft on communism, of devaluing the investment, which includes the blood of American soldiers that's already been sunk into an affair like that. It's something where if you imagine a Lyndon Johnson having the power of a Soviet leader, and let's not pretend that they were, Stalin had a ton of power, but people like Khrushchev, they still had to worry about underlings and all that. That's how Khrushchev got thrown out of power eventually. But they had a ton more ability to just say, no, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do and not worry about an electorate throwing them out or something. So I do think that this is not to excuse anything, because you're absolutely right, and we have paid a huge price for what is now called the credibility gap, where when Johnson lies to the American people, after a while, nobody believes anything he says, and that can mess you up politically too. But yes, he definitely lied about Vietnam, and we heard so often about that the light was at the end of the tunnel, and that was what was so nasty about the Tet Offensive, is that it, and I believe, I'm going from memory, but I believe it was almost one of the ideas behind the launching of the Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese, was this idea that we're going to show the American people that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And if there was, how could we do this? Now, I should point out, because every soldier, every commander I ever talked to from Vietnam emphasizes this, the Tet Offensive was an absolute disaster for the North Vietnamese in terms of casualties and losses and everything else. But it was a political decision to shatter the American idea that the war was going well, and it was worth losing a lot of your forces to do that. And that really is right out of Clausewitz, right? This is the goal here is to win the war, not to win the battles on the ground. And we'll lose all these battles as a way to show the Americans back home that your government is lying to you and that this is nowhere near over. But to answer your question, I do think it was poisonous, and I do think you can read the Daniel Ellsberg works and the Pentagon Papers and all that stuff and see exactly what was it John Dean said eventually, there was a cancer growing on the presidency when you got to Watergate and all that. But I would make a case that what you're saying is right, and the cancer growing on the presidency probably started with Johnson and the credibility gap.
Yeah, I think to your point, when Tet first started, January 1968, and all this stuff is I guess, what if the federal government had explained this within a proper context and explained what was happening, and then continued to explain, the Americans retook Hue at a certain point. I think it was February, by the time the end of February. Yeah. Might have been March. But bottom line is, had they explained all this within context and been more candid and had a greater measure of credibility, perhaps they could have carried that further in Vietnam. Or perhaps when people saw on broadcast TV, people saw the images of Tet, perhaps they just grown exhausted with it.
I think the metrics were problematic too. The way that the military and the government tried to determine or at least show progress to the American people was flawed. And I think the North Vietnamese understood this innately, but the idea of things like body counts, that this was somehow a sign of measurable progress. And I think Tet's a perfect example of how that gets shoved back in your face, because the body count situation was well in the favor of the United States, but it didn't matter. And it was the political solution that was what was the only thing that mattered. And I think once you have such a problem with the American people turning against the war, It's funny because the Japanese in the Second World War had never expected to take over the United States. Their plan for victory was to simply outlast them, right? To be willing to suck up more casualties than the U.S. would be willing to suck up. One could make a case that that was the North Vietnamese strategy in the Vietnam War, too. And so this body count thing almost played into that because you think, okay, we're giving 10-1 casualties to these people, we must be winning. Yes, but if they're willing to take 15-1 casualties, you're really not. And if the home front is collapsing because they don't want to pay the price to do this anymore, or they don't see the value of the expenditure, well, then, it undercuts the ability to continue to fight. And you can see this by Nixon's administration. He is so hamstrung in the negotiations that when he launches the Cambodian bombings as a way to influence the intransigence of the North Vietnamese negotiators, the country explodes. And so his hands are completely tied by that point. When we talk about the political system and how in a free world situation, the hands of the leadership is much more tied than in a more dictatorial regime, I think that's something the North Vietnamese understood and exploited. And by 1970, you have the New Left planting bombs in recruiting offices and stuff. I mean, I read one of Nixon's memoirs had said that there was something like 1,000 bombing attacks or bomb threats in 1 year in the United States. Well, to Americans living at that time, it looks like your country's falling apart. And if your country's falling apart, how can you really maintain the kind of war effort that those people would associate with, World War II and pulling together and all that kind of stuff? It is a wonderful lesson in a weird way about, like you were talking about earlier, asymmetrical warfare, how the nuclear weapons and all that superpower that we had availed us not at all in this kind of a conflict, and how all these wonderful thinkers, and I go back to the Rand Corporation and all those people, how they could put paper after paper after paper out about how to win wars, and yet if the home front is collapsing, none of that stuff matters. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the presidents at the time because I don't see, if we're playing the what-if game, I don't see a lot of wiggle room for what LBJ does or what Nixon does. It's easy to say now they should have won the war or they should have gotten out of the war. But if you go look at the day-to-day stuff they were dealing with, I'm not sure either of those things were ever on the table. Does that make sense?
It does. LBJ politically could not have gotten out of the war. I don't think he really had an option to do that.
Vietnamization was what they were talking about. The only way they could think to get out of the war was to do what the original plan was, which is, give them the tools and they'll finish the fight. Go back to we're going to strengthen the South Vietnamese forces so they can do this themselves, and that didn't work.
Yeah. One thing when you're talking about some of the challenges of a free democratic nation, and one of the basic principles of underpinning the United States in the Cold War is a free and aggressive press, and that worked against LBJ in Vietnam in that we did have a very independent American press covering South Vietnam, but they couldn't really cover the North Vietnamese units. And the North Vietnamese tightly controlled the press covering their units. And so they had very tight control over the press, very strict controls that we didn't have. And so the North Vietnamese atrocities were not covered in the same detail as My Lai, for example. And
I think the press angle is really good. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, because I don't think we think of that dichotomy. And then, the other thing is, like, Gregory Daddis is a guy who's been working in this field now for years. And his view, I only caveat it to him, I only attribute it to him because it's in dispute, is that the American press covering these things wasn't really all that informed until after Tet. And so they were just covering what they were seeing. They didn't speak the country. They didn't really understand, just like the American officers, there. And so, anyway, bottom line, my point is that allowing all that press access really worked against LBJ. And, the North didn't have that problem.
As a guy who was a press guy myself, I'm fascinated by what you just brought up, because if you look at the history of American media, I would say that the period where the U.S. media was the most free to do what they wanted to in these kind of situations, I would say 1966 to 1985, 86. And it's a really small window, actually. But before that, in the Second World War, the press was thoroughly on board with the conflict. They were an active arm of the government in the war effort. And yet, they did go out in the field. You have guys like Ernie Pyle, who gets killed, actually, like reporting the war, but they're on the ground. I mean, today we would call them embeds, but I wouldn't even think of them as embedded forces. I mean, they just were living with the troops and writing about what that was about and everything else. And then in the 50s, of course, they're active players and all that. It's a very rah-rah sort of patriotic press. I think you brought up earlier the reason that changed, and it had to do with this idea that the government was lying to us. And when, during the LBJ administration, the idea that what the government was feeding the population did not match what the press was seeing on the ground. And certainly that the U.S., and you pointed out that I think a good way to put this is not that the media didn't know that the North Vietnamese were conducting atrocities. I think they did, but I don't think they expected anything different from the bad guys. I think what they were upset about was that the good guys were doing some of that too. And they showed that because they could show that. I think, though, with things like, with Tet, I think you saw the bad guys being shown doing bad stuff, but I don't think anyone ever expected anything different. I think because the American population had been shielded from a lot of, let's just call it the dirty side of war, or the fact that sometimes your allies aren't always that pleasant. I think that was somewhat shocking. And I had a professor once in journalism who said it was the propaganda press of the previous period that had not well set the United States public up for the realities of war, so that when we had set them up for a very good guy, bad guy situation, and yet you saw that it's a lot messier, realism is a lot messier than that, they weren't prepared for that. And especially with a very idealistic generation coming up, the baby boomers and all that, I think it played into this whole idea that somehow we weren't the shining knights that we were portrayed to be. And when the media showed that, it seemed to confirm those perceptions. It was also what they wanted to believe. A lot of these people did not relish the idea of being drafted and going off to the war. So when you could show these things of U.S. troops burning the huts of villagers, that just played into the idea that it's a bad war. I don't want to go to the war. What did Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali, said, what did the Viet Cong ever do to me? I think this gets back to what we talked about earlier, how we can't divorce the geopolitical or the military situation from the tenor of the times. And to get back to the credibility gap, I think what the media was doing was showing that the government was lying to you, and that led to an adversarial press. So now I don't know how you fix that either without putting the kind of wartime censorship we had in the Second World War. And I think I would argue that we've gone back to some of that we don't cover wars as freely as we covered Vietnam. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. I feel personally like I'd show everything, and if the people can't handle it, then we shouldn't be there. But I would say that we've never had the kind of coverage, and I'm sure you've seen it. One of my favorite film footage, and I've seen somebody run it through, I think it was Ken Burns ran it through a computer enhancement thing, so it looks like you shot it on your iPhone, is when you had reporters actually interviewing American soldiers, I think it was in Hue during Tet, and they're reloading their weapons and firing them over a wall and then coming down to reload the weapon again. And every time they come down to reload the weapon, the reporter sticks the microphone in their face and said, how you feeling right now? And the guy said, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. I mean, you couldn't have done that in the Second World War, and I don't think you could do it now. Now, does that undercut the war effort? I think it does. But once again, I would argue that if the American public is prepared for the realities of conflict, I think it does it less. But I think we've sold everybody on a good guy, bad guy sort of scenario that when the reality on the ground somehow clashed with that, at least some of the population found it offensive. They recoiled from it. Or like you had said, when you see, what's the famous shot from the Tet Offensive when the South Vietnamese general executes the captured Viet Cong with the pistol shot to the head. It's one of the most famous photos ever. I mean, when I think it was Time or Life published that, it exploded like a bombshell on the U.S. consciousness. If this had been understood to be just part of the reality on the ground in that situation in the decade previously, I don't think it would have had the same kind of impact. But I think because it was sold in a different way, it made everybody look like a bad guy, or certainly made the people we were supporting not look that noble. Does that make sense?
It's all a fascinating look at that function. That's in the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary where the soldier is shooting over the wall and then he's reloading and he's obviously in distress and the guy's right in his face.
He's in combat, I know.
He's in his, and the soldier, almost to his credit, he doesn't say, hey man, get out of here. He's actually answering the guy's questions. He's like, I don't remember what he said, but he's like, this is terrible. This sucks.
He said, I want to go. I remember he said, I just want to go home.
Yeah.
And that may, and here's the other thing is that if you had tried to get that through the wartime censors 20 years previously, you wouldn't have been able to.
Right, yeah. One thing, maybe we can, this has been kind of a bit of a broad whirlwind discussion here, but maybe we can land on this thing, and I wasn't planning on bringing this up. And it's not necessarily apropos of anything, but it's apropos of the Cold War, which is what we're ostensibly talking about. When I went to the Army War College, when I was a student in the Army War College, there is a framed cartoon from the New Yorker, I don't know when, but it must have been 1995, of Robert McNamara, and he's holding his autobiography in retrospective, which you remember in 95, he went on a publicity tour selling in retrospective.
I'm looking at the book right now on my bookshelf.
Yeah, and so in this drawing, he's looking at the Vietnam Wall Memorial in D.C., and he says, sorry about that. It's a stunning... I took a picture of it. I used to go over there and look at it. It wasn't a cover, but it was from the New Yorker. I tried to get it replicated. But, really, that's McNamara, and that's LBJ. And so, McNamara started... I think the Kennedy administration with good intentions. He was a Cold Warrior in the truest sense, in the way that Nixon and even Truman in some ways was. But the Cold War, I think, made some of these people less moral.
Well, let's understand, because I don't think there weren't any Cold Warriors. If you go look back, there's nobody talking about making all nice with the other side. I think there's degrees of intensity on some of these people. And there were certainly people that were, Curtis LeMay and that crowd, the general Pattonites out there are willing to promote confrontation to get it over with. Maybe they're at the far end of the scale, and then the other ones are talking more of a détente kind of thing at the far end of the other scale. But I think everybody's a Cold Warrior in that era, and not to excuse any of these people, but I think we also have to remember that we're looking at this with hindsight. One, I don't think they know what would work and what didn't work until they tried it. And I think when all the experts are telling you, and this is where Kennedy found himself when he took over, when all the experts are saying this is what you should do, it's really hard to go, really? Is it? And then when it doesn't work, it's really hard to say, okay, your plans didn't work, so what do we do now? I think we know how dumb a lot of the LBJ moves were because LBJ did them and they didn't work. But until they didn't work, first of all, let's remember, with the United States, you're talking about a military that we famously, when I was growing up, used to say, never lost a war. And so there was this attitude at the time that sending American forces in would ipso facto fix it. And until you have to, the whole late 1970s, early 1980s was the coming to grips that, no, you know what, that doesn't always work. You remember when George Bush, the elder, had done the Gulf War in 91, 92, and he said, we finally kicked the Vietnam Syndrome. Well, what was the Vietnam Syndrome? It was this unwillingness to throw troops into combat because all of a sudden you realized after Vietnam that isn't necessarily a magic bullet, that it doesn't always work. But you don't know that until it doesn't. And I think you started by talking about Korea. And I would suggest that your point was well taken early on, that maybe the Korean lesson was not fully internalized or was not seen as indicative of anything you could learn from. Because really that should have been seen as the time when there is no magic bullet and you can't just send U.S. forces in and just say, okay, it's going to be over with now. I think a lot of what LBJ did, I think if you could bring him back on this planet, put him back in that situation, and give him the hindsight we have now, he'd do it differently. And McNamara, the real thing you can fault them for, perhaps, is the thing that you did fault them for, which is the credibility gap stuff, the lying stuff, the light is at the end of the tunnel stuff, because I think that ended up undermining them. And I think had they been able to be more honest, and this is just a guess too, but I think maybe it would have worked in their favor more so that when things didn't turn out as well as quickly, people would have said something to the effect of, well, we knew it was going to be a long war. We knew it was, I think when you set up, don't worry, we're almost done. And then you're not. It's like telling somebody that the race they're running is almost done. And then when they run past the finish line or they see the finish line, moving the finish line. You can only get away with that so much. So I do think even though McNamara gets a ton of blame, I try to cut all these historical figures some slack because I'm not sure a lot of other people would have done it a whole lot differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fair. I think you'd like to think other public officials would have been more honest about the whole thing.
But Nixon took over took a lot of these people out, put his own people in, and he wasn't getting a whole lot of different advice.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and I guess, like we were saying, that everyone's a Cold Warrior in this era. There was nobody saying, there was no George Kennans and none of those people who could radically reimagine the global situation. This is where we should probably give Nixon some credit, because the whole détente idea, which now doesn't even look like that big of a deal, was a huge change in the approach.
Yeah.
Those are really radical things. And I don't think that was really an advisor thing. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that was a Nixon thing. And I'm not a Nixon fan, but I think you got to give credit where it's due. That really was transformative thinking. That's like the opening of China. That was really transformative stuff. And I don't think LBJ had that kind of flexibility in 1967.
I'll just make one little anecdote here. I find it humorous. It's a parallel to what you're saying about if you're told early on, you know, we're winning the war, it's going to be over soon, light at the end of the tunnel, and then years later, you know, the parallel to this is in 2007, the first time I was ever in Afghanistan, the commander there, this guy's out of the Army, said, look, we're turning the corner in Afghanistan. You know, we are really taking it to the Taliban, we're turning the corner. I go back in 2010. Different commander, same thing. We're taking it to, literally the same words. We're taking it to the Taliban. We're turning the corner in Afghanistan. When I heard that, you know, to 2013, we're turning the corner. That was a public statement. Now, I wasn't in Afghanistan at the time. We're turning the corner in Afghanistan. When I heard that in 2016, we're turning the corner in Afghanistan, I thought, well, how many times are we going to turn this corner? I mean, we've been turning this corner for 10 years. You know, I mean, this is the same thing with like light at the end of the tunnel, you know, because we gave the light at the end of the tunnel talking point, I think, 4 or 5 times.
You know what's funny, though? I think that can still be half right. I think the part about we're taking it to the Taliban might have been totally correct.
Yeah.
And just like we were kicking the bejesus out of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, we really were.
Yeah.
But that did not ipso facto mean that the light was at the end of the tunnel.
But Westmoreland knew that. Westmoreland knew that we were not winning.
You're right.
When he said that.
You're right. Absolutely.
So, all right, well, look, maybe we covered a lot of ground here. I think we covered like 70 years. We went from 1945 to Afghanistan, you know.
Usually that takes me about 26 hours with my podcast, so well done.
All right, well, look, Dan, thanks so much. You know, I hope we'll stay in touch, you know, who knows.
I appreciate your time, and if I can do anything to help, just let me know.
No, I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much. And look, let's stay in touch, Dan.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
That was Dan Carlin. Great guy. Awesome guy. Just a fascinating, a really fascinating, thoughtful guy to talk to. And, you know, that was a great discussion. It was really exciting for me to do it. I was excited when he agreed to do it. And we covered an awful lot of ground in that discussion. I hope it was as fascinating for you to listen to as it was for me to put together. Thank you so much for continuing to listen to and support the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. Tell others about the show. We've got some really big guests coming up. We've got a lot of big topics coming up, and we're excited for all the ideas and information we're going to bring you. Thank you so much.